The hiss of water broke the silence before anyone dared to move. Inside a stark concrete building, swallowed by the sprawling Texas brush and gnarled mesquite trees, 50 German women stood shivering, stripped to their underclothes, their bare feet pressed against the frigid cement floor. A U.S. Army sergeant at the doorway barked an order, his words sliced into German by a translator. "Everyone inside. You'll wash before your uniforms are issued." To the battle-weary Americans, it was mundane routine. To the prisoners, it was the beginning of the nightmare they had been promised. A whisper, frail and fractured with terror, cut through the humid air. "They're making a shower together." Another woman clutched the thin fabric of her shirt as if it were a suit of armor, her knuckles white. "This is how it starts," she muttered in her native tongue, the words a grim echo of the propaganda that had shaped their fears. "This is how they kill us." With a metallic groan, the pipes overhead shuddered to life. Dozens of women flinched as one, a frozen tableau of dread. Their eyes, wide with a hunted animal panic, darted upward, searching for the invisible. Odorless death the Reich had warned them awaited prisoners in the West. The gas, the humiliation, the extermination, but instead of poison, a cascade of cold, clear water rained down. The reaction was not relief, but a visceral explosion of shattered reality. A scream tore from one woman's throat. Then another dropped to her knees, her body racked with sobs that seemed to tear from her very soul. A third woman began to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that bordered on madness, the pressure of certain doom giving way to incomprehensible survival. A fourth pressed her trembling hands to her face, the water streaming through her fingers as she whispered a sacred mantra of disbelief. "It's not gas. It's just soap. It's just soap." The sergeant at the door frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Is the water too cold?" he grumbled. But the translator, a German-American corporal with understanding dawning in his eyes, replied quietly, "Sir, they thought we were going to kill them." The American fell silent, removing his cap as the weight of the moment settled over him. In the echoing din of water and fractured nerves, no one moved. Then one of the older women, her hair matted and streaked with the grit of weeks of transport, reached for the bar of soap. It was white, fragrant, utterly ordinary. She began to scrub her arms, the simple act feeling both profane and sacred. She looked at the lather in her hand, and the tears came harder, not of fear but of a devastating, profound revelation. That night, in the quiet of the barracks, she would write in her journal, her script shaky, "I never thought I would cry over soap, but when the water came, and it was only water, I knew we had been lied to our whole lives." This single, searing moment fades into the grand, forgotten statistics of history. Between 1942 and 1946, over 400,000 Axis prisoners were held on American soil. Among this tide of humanity were a small number of German women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, captured far from home. Many were sent to work camps in Texas, a world away from the bombed-out ruins of Europe. There were fences, yes, and vigilant guards. But what awaited them inside was not the promised hatred. It was routine, order, and above all, a bewildering sense of dignity. For women reared in the shadow of the Third Reich, a regime that worshipped strength and despised mercy. This was a captivity they could not comprehend. One former prisoner would later tell a historian, "When they made us shower that first day, we thought it was our end, but it was our beginning." The camera of history pans wide, across the sun-baked red soil of Texas, the glint of afternoon light on barbed wire, the distant, lonesome sound of cattle on the open range. From that moment on, these German women began an emotional odyssey few would believe, a journey from terror to trust, from the fear of death to the rediscovery of their own humanity. And it all started with water and a bar of soap. The train rattled across the barren plains, a metal serpent choking on dust and sunlight. Inside its cramped car, dozens of German women sat shoulder to shoulder, a silent tapestry of hollow eyes and weary souls. The war in Europe had ended for them, but their minds remained its prisoners. They had been fed a steady diet of dread, Nazi officers had whispered, before their capture, that Americans were savages who treated prisoners worse than animals, that women would be starved, humiliated, or executed. Some steeled themselves for forced labor camps in a merciless desert. Others braced for the cold horror of medical experiments. As the train groaned to a slow halt near the tiny Texas town of Hearn, a surreal vision materialized through the grime-caked windows. Instead of a phalanx of black uniformed guards, there were men in wide-brimmed hats and dust-caked boots, cowboys. Some leaned idly against fence posts, chewing tobacco with lazy indifference. Others were unloading crates filled with loaves of bread, flour, and cans of beans from a weathered truck. A ripple of confusion passed through the prisoners. This was not the monstrous America of their fears. The doors screeched open and a wall of hot, heavy air rushed in, carrying the unfamiliar scents of hay and cattle. The women squinted, blinded by the relentless Texas sun. "Where are the whips? The guns?" one whispered, her voice thin. "Maybe they're waiting inside," another replied, her tone heavy with suspicion. They were herded from the train, but the guards did not shout or strike. Instead, a tall, freckled soldier in his 20s offered a hesitant smile and held out a canteen. "Welcome to Texas," he said in slow, careful English. They didn't understand his words. A German nurse named L would recall years later. But they recognized his tone. It wasn't cruelty. It was calm. He spoke as if we were guests, not prisoners. I didn't know whether to be insulted or profoundly relieved. The camp itself was a paradox. Neat rows of wooden barracks stood behind the obligatory barbed wire. But beyond the fence lay fields of green corn, a mess hall, and even a small whitewashed chapel. The guards were young Americans from Texas and Oklahoma, most barely older than the prisoners themselves. At roll call, an officer addressed them through the translator, his voice firm but not unkind. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, eat, and rest. You are not slaves. You are prisoners of war, and you will be treated with dignity." The women stood ramrod straight, their faces masks of ingrained suspicion. They had heard the word dignity before, always from men who did not mean it. That night, their first meal was a silent, spectral affair. When the trays were laid out, bearing soft white bread, a rich vegetable soup, and the dark, aromatic promise of real coffee, a profound hush fell over the mess hall. It was a silence thick with suspicion, a collective holding of breath. A few women pushed their plates away, their minds whispering of hidden poisons. Others, driven by a gnawing hunger that outweighed their fear, took tentative tastes. Then, as flavor exploded on their starved palates, caution shattered. They devoured everything, the clatter of their spoons a frantic percussion of survival. One woman, her voice a hushed tremor of awe, turned to her neighbor. "If this is how they treat their enemies," she whispered, "how do they feast their own people?" Outside, the lonely chorus of coyotes serenaded the vast Texas prairie, their cries mingling with the electric hum of crickets. The war with its thunder and fire felt a world away. Yet the old fears clung like shadows. But deep within the hearts of the prisoners, a new seed had been planted, fragile, uncertain, but tenacious. What if every single thing we were told about America was a lie? For these women, captivity had just begun. But so had the slow, painful, glorious unraveling of their entire world. Morning in Texas dawned not with the crack of gunfire, but with the rustic crowing of roosters. The German women awoke to golden sunlight streaming through the wooden slats of their barracks, the air thick with the scent of dust and fresh pine. Instead of barked commands, they were greeted by the clatter of breakfast trays and the low, swinging rhythm of a radio playing a Benny Goodman tune. They were alive, and more than that, they were being nourished. The camp at Hearn was a study in orderly containment. Barracks stood in neat military rows, each bunk made up with fresh blankets and crisp sheets that still carried the clean floral scent of detergent. They had been issued sturdy, clean uniforms stamped with the stark letters POW. when one prisoner, through the translator, timidly asked if they might wash their clothes. The American sergeant let out a short, genuine laugh. "Hell, we've got soap!" "Plenty of it," he said, hefting a bar from a nearby crate. "You'll end up smelling better than we do." That single, offhand joke, imperfectly translated, sent ripples of profound confusion through the women. They had been molded by a regime where authority was carved from fear and unquestioning obedience. The concept of a guard who joked, who offered a moment of human connection instead of a threat, felt like a crack in the very fabric of their reality. In the mess hall, long tables were set with simple tin plates. Breakfast was a revelation: scrambled eggs, fresh bread, a pat of golden butter, and a single crisp slice of bacon. The prisoners hesitated, the ghost of propaganda warning of toxins. But one woman, Lau, the nurse from the North African campaign, was the first to break. She took a careful bite. She chewed slowly, her eyes widening. Then silent tears began to trace paths through the grime still on her cheeks. "It's real," she breathed. "It's all real food. The dam broke." Soon, the hall was filled with the sounds of earnest eating and murmurs of stunned disbelief. One prisoner voiced the thought they all shared. "They feed us better than the fatherland fed its own soldiers." After meals, they were assigned work details: mending uniforms, scrubbing floors, tending the camp's victory garden, or caring for livestock on nearby farms. For their labor, they were paid a small stipend in camp scrip, currency for small luxuries: cigarettes, chocolate, postcards home. The discipline was firm, but it was a fairness they scarcely recognized. Guards were under strict orders to enforce rules without humiliation. Any American soldier who mistreated a prisoner faced disciplinary action. Himself, a concept that stunned women accustomed to a world where power was absolute and unchecked. A Red Cross representative visited monthly, inspecting food stores and medical facilities. The camp doctor treated them with the same professional care he afforded his own comrades. Antibiotics, sterile bandages, and always more soap, commodities that had become mythical rarities in wartime Germany, were available here in shocking abundance. For the first time in years, their bodies began to truly heal. Skin cleared, hair regained its luster from forgotten nutrition, and strength seeped back into their limbs. But healing the body was one thing. Mending the mind was another. At night, lying in their bunks, the women whispered in the dark, their voices hushed with a bewildered reverence. "Why?" one would ask, the question hanging in the air. "Why is there so much kindness here?" Another would offer the only answer that made a terrible kind of sense. "Perhaps because they can afford to be." That sentence lingered. It wasn't merely about material wealth. It was about an abundance of spirit, a quiet, unshakable confidence, and something far deeper. The women began to see that American power was not forged in the fires of hatred or the gale of propaganda, but in a calm, effortless strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. In the heart of a Texas POW camp, thousands of miles from home, they were learning a lesson their own leaders had never taught them: that true order does not spring from fear. It blossoms from dignity. The memory of that first terror-soaked shower was a ghost that haunted them all. So, when the order came on another sun-scorched morning for new uniforms and medical checks, a familiar dread coiled in their stomachs. The sun was a merciless white orb in the vast Texas sky, as guards directed them toward the long, low concrete building at the camp's edge, the shower house. The women hesitated at the threshold. The damp, mineral smell of wet concrete, the skeletal network of pipes overhead, the echoing drum of water on tile. It was a sensory trigger that sent them reeling back into that first day of raw animal fear. Many had heard the whispered horrors from the east, of rooms that looked like showers, where water never flowed and death came on an invisible breath. One woman, Anna, froze completely. Her knees locked, the blood draining from her face, leaving her as pale as the morning sky. 9, she whispered, a desperate, choked refusal. Not again. Let's go, ladies, move along. A guard called, his tone pragmatic, not cruel. Get cleaned up. Soap's on the bench. But the translator, Corporal Meyer, saw the panic blooming in their eyes. He understood the chasm of fear that the American sergeant could not see. They're terrified, sir, he said quietly. They think it's a gas chamber. The sergeant frowned, his brow furrowed in genuine bafflement. Gas? What in God's name for? It's a damn shower. Inside, the air was chill. The pipes groaned like awakening beasts, and when the first jet of water burst from the nozzle, a chorus of screams tore through the room. Some women dropped to their knees as if struck. Others clutched each other, a tangle of trembling limbs and wide, unseeing eyes. One began to sob, great, heaving cries that seemed to tear from the deepest part of her soul. The guards, startled and uncomfortable, could only exchange helpless, confused glances, utterly lost in the landscape of a trauma they had not lived and could not name. For a heart-stopping moment, the scene teetered on the edge of panic. Then the translator, Corporal Meyer, moved. It's just water, he called out, his voice cutting through the cacophony of terror. Look, only water! He strode purposefully to an open shower head and stepped directly into the spray, fully clothed. The cold water plastered his hair to his forehead and darkened his uniform, but he stood there, a living testament. You see? It's clean. You are safe here. The gesture was so simple, so profoundly human that it broke the spell. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension in the room began to dissolve. A few women reached tentative hands into the streams, their fingers tracing the liquid as if it were a miracle. A sound bubbled up from one of them, a laugh, brittle and watery, that quickly melted into relieved sobs. Anna, her body still trembling, caught the bar of soap she was offered. It was bright white, delicately perfumed. She stared at it in her palm as if it were a sacred artifact. That night her journal entry bore the watermark of her tears. When the water came, I cried. Not from the cold, but because it was only water. In that moment I knew with a certainty that shook my soul. Every story we were told about American cruelty, about their bottomless hatred, was a poison lie. Word of the incident rippled through the camp. The Americans hadn't harmed them. They had given them soap, thick towels, and clean, sun-fresh clothes. For many, that single steamy morning marked the definitive end of years of manufactured fear and the fragile, terrifying beginning of something new. Trust. When they emerged from the shower house, their hair damp and smelling of lavender, their new uniforms crisp against their skin, a few even dared to smile. The sergeant, who had watched the chaotic scene unfold, muttered to Meyer, "They truly believed we were capable of that?" Meyer nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the now calm women. "That is the only truth the Reich ever gave them." The American looked out toward the endless open sky, shaking his head in a mixture of pity and resolve. "Well," he grunted, "I guess they never met Texans before." From that day on, the showers transformed. They became a ritual not of dread, but of quiet rebirth. The women began to speak freely, their voices lifting in conversation, even punctuated by soft, genuine laughter. The guards noticed the shift. The air in the barracks was lighter. The silences were thoughtful, not tense. As one prisoner later reflected, that water washed more than the grime from our skin. It washed the lies from our minds. In that steamy, echoing room in the heart of Texas, the war, for these women, had truly come to an end. In the days that followed, a palpable change swept through the camp. The German women, once hunched and silent, began to walk with their chins lifted. The Americans noted the transformation. The haunted, hollow look in their eyes was receding, replaced by a spark of cautious curiosity. The camp commander, a broad-shouldered Texan named Captain Harris, held a firm belief. An idle mind and idle hands breed nothing but trouble, he'd say. Work heals, and this land's got plenty of healing to give. So, when a request came from a neighboring cattle ranch for help with feeding and fence mending, he agreed to send a work detail under light guard. When the truck rattled to a stop at the ranch, the women were met with a sight that stole their breath. The land unfolded in great rolling waves of red earth and scrub, stretching to a horizon so vast it felt like the edge of the world. Cattle lowed in the distance, and waiting for them were a group of cowboys, their postures relaxed in sweat-stained hats and dusty jeans, looking as if they'd been carved from the landscape itself. One of them, a lanky young man named Luke, tipped his hat. "Y'all ever been up close with a horse before?" he asked, his drawl as slow and warm as honey. The translator relayed the question, and the women offered cautious nods. One murmured, only from a distance, during the marches. Luke broke into a wide, easy grin. "Well, ma'am, we're fixing to change that." Within minutes, the cowboys were demonstrating how to hold the reins, how to brush a coat until it shone, how to calm a skittish animal with a soft word and a steady hand. The women watched, mesmerized. In their Germany, horses were instruments of war, symbols of officer-class privilege. They were not for prisoners. They were certainly not for women. Yet here, these Americans offered the reins as if offering a gift. One woman, Elise, hung back from a chestnut mare that seemed to tower over her. "She will bite," Elise stated, a statement of fact from a life where kindness was always conditional. Luke gave a low chuckle. "Not unless you give her a reason." He gently took her hand and placed the leather reins in her palm, guiding her touch. "Easy now." She can smell fear. When the mare instead nuzzled her open hand, sniffing curiously, Elise froze. Then a sound escaped her. A soft, shocked laugh of pure wonder that drew smiles from even the most stoic guards. By midday, several women were brushing the horses with focused reverence. A few of the bravest even allowed themselves to be helped into the saddle. The cowboys watched, arms crossed, their expressions a mix of amusement and respect. One muttered to his friend, "They ain't half bad for beginners." For the German women it was a taste of a freedom they had forgotten existed. The endless cerulean sky, the gentle creak of the saddle, the honest smells of leather, hay, and earth, it was an intoxicating balm. For a few precious hours, the barbed wire and the ghosts of the past simply ceased to be. When the work was done, the cowboys shared their lunch, simple, hearty fare of cornbread, beans, and crisp bacon. The prisoners hesitated, the old rules of separation ringing in their minds. But Captain Harris gestured to an empty spot on a hay bale. "Ain't no harm in breaking bread together," he said. So they ate, captors and captives, under the blazing generosity of the Texas sun, the lowing of contented cattle a peaceful soundtrack in the distance. That evening, as the truck carried them back to camp, the women were quiet. But this silence was not born of fear, it was thick with wonder. Elle, the nurse, whispered, almost to herself, "They let us ride their horses. They trust us." And Anna, looking out at the fading sunset, replied softly, "And we did not try to escape." That night, a new kind of silence filled the barracks, a peaceful, reflective, almost holy quiet. The whispered conversations were no longer of death or vengeance. They were of the gentle eyes of a chestnut mare, the rough kindness of cowboys, and the strange healing power of an open Texas sky. The fences of the camp were still there, a physical fact, but in their hearts, they no longer felt like the walls of a prison. The days began to find their rhythm, a cadence that felt less like confinement and more like a life rediscovering its pulse. Wake up at dawn, roll call under a pastel sky, breakfast of warm bread, sweet jam, and strong coffee. Then came the work assignments, the steady, purposeful labor that gave their hands an honest task and their weary minds a rest. Some women were sent to the laundry, where they scrubbed uniforms in great steaming vats and hung them to dry, the fabrics snapping like flags in the sharp Texas wind. Others worked in the gardens, their hands sinking into the rich, dark soil, tending to rows of plump tomatoes and vibrant okra. nurturing life from the earth itself. A select few were assigned to the sprawling ranches that bordered the camp, mucking out stables, gathering warm eggs from beneath clucking hens, and learning the rhythmic pull of milking a cow. The pay was a pittance, 5 cents an hour in camp script, but the act of earning it was a currency far more valuable. For the first time since their capture, they had a purpose that was not born from fear. One woman, Helga, who had been a teacher in a life that now felt like a dream, confided in her diary, "We are working, but it does not feel like punishment. There are no blows, only quiet thank yous." The Americans seem to operate on an astonishing principle, that labor affirms our humanity. It does not strip it away. This philosophy left them breathless. Under the Reich, work had been a cudgel of control, a measure of one's utility to the state. Here in the Texas heat, work was dignity. A well-swept floor, a perfectly weeded row of vegetables. These small perfections earned them nods of approval, even quiet respect. One morning, as the women gathered their tools, a young sergeant named Miller leaned against a fence post, watching. He was barely 21, but carried the innate patience of a man raised by the land. "You know," he said to the translator, his voice laced with admiration, "they work harder than most farmhands I've ever hired." When the words were translated, a few of the women looked up, and for the first time in a long time, genuine smiles touched their lips. In their old world, a compliment from a superior was rarer than freedom itself. The true turning point came when Captain Harris announced the camp canteen was open for business. Their hard-earned scrip could now be exchanged for small luxuries: scented soap, writing paper, chocolate bars, and most miraculous of all, frosted bottles of Coca-Cola. The women stared as if beholding artifacts from another planet. In Germany, Coca-Cola was a whispered legend, a symbol of an unimaginable, decadent world. Elle bought one, cradling the cold, curved glass in her hands like a holy relic. She took a tentative sip, her face first tightening at the unfamiliar aggressive fizz, then softening into an expression of pure, unguarded wonder. Later she would write in her diary, "It did not taste like the enemy. It did not taste like victory. It tasted like something we had forgotten was allowed. Simple, bubbly happiness." The guards, too, were undergoing a quiet transformation. They no longer saw faceless enemies, but individuals, women who laughed at a joke, who blushed at a kindness, who worked until their hands were raw. Cigarettes were shared after a long shift. On still evenings, a guard might play a lonesome harmonica tune by the fence, and from the barracks, a soft hum would weave itself into the melody. The fences still stood. The signs still read PW. But in the quiet spaces between duty and decency, an invisible force was at work, patiently eroding the walls between them, a mutual recognition that neither uniform nor language could erase. Helga captured it best in a letter that would never reach home. "We were told the Americans were barbarians, but they have taught us that true strength does not need to shout. It can be found in a quiet voice, a helping hand, in the simple act of listening. This lesson is in the soil, in the air, in every shared task. Texas is changing us, not with chains, but with an ordinary, relentless humanity." By the autumn of 1944, a crispness had stolen into the Texas air, but the women in the camp carried a different kind of chill, the heavy silence of waiting for news that might never come. The Red Cross had finally established a mail service, permitting each prisoner 2 heavily censored letters per month, their words confined to pre-printed forms, yet bursting with unspoken emotion. The first delivery arrived on a dry, wind-scoured afternoon. A guard rolled a metal cart into the yard and began calling names from a list. The women stood in rigid rows, their faces a battlefield of hope and dread. "Schneider, L!" She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she took the envelope. The handwriting was her husband's, a familiar slanted script that sent a jolt through her heart. She turned away before breaking the seal. clutching the paper to her chest as if it were a living thing. Others were not so lucky. For many, the guard's voice called nothing but the next name. The silence that answered was a verdict in itself. The Americans averted their eyes, understanding the grim truth. A void where a letter should be often meant there was no home left to write from. That evening, the barracks were hushed, lit by the weak glow of a single bulb. Women sat by the windows, their faces illuminated and shadowed by turns as they devoured the inked words from another world. Some laughed through tears at a mundane detail. "Your rose bush has bloomed," while others wept silently, the paper trembling in their hands. Lau read her letter 3 times. Her husband had written, "They tell us the Americans are devils, but if they have captured you, I pray to God they are kind. Remember, my love, no war lasts forever." She folded the paper with exquisite care and whispered to the empty air, "They are kinder than I ever dared to dream, Helga." The teacher received a short, stark note from her parents in Dresden. It was only 10 lines, the last one smudged, as if written in a frantic hurry. "The nights are long. The sirens never stop. We hope you are alive." She folded it away, a cold stone of fear in her stomach, unaware that in a few months Dresden would be swallowed by fire. For those with no letters, the camp became their entire universe. The rhythm of work, meals, and chores became a bulwark against despair. Yet, even within the barbed wire, life insisted on blooming. The women began teaching each other English. They painted delicate watercolors of the vast, dramatic skies. They recited recipes from memory, Apfelstrudel, Kartoffelsuppe, conjuring feasts from nothing but shared remembrance. One night, during a gentle rainstorm, Captain Harris passed by the women's barracks and heard a faint melodic sound. The prisoners were singing. It was not a martial anthem, but a soft, sorrowful hymn, their voices weaving together into a lullaby of loss and resilience. He did not understand the words, but he understood the heart behind them. The next day, he ordered more art supplies for the camp. "Let them create," he told his sergeants. "It's better than letting the memories consume them." These small gestures, the chance to send a word home, to raise a voice in song, to capture beauty on a blank page, became their lifeline. For women who had been reduced to instruments of a brutal regime, Texas had given them something radical and profound, the sacred right to be human again. And though they did not yet know it, the fragile threads they were spinning, the ink-stained letters, the whispered songs, the faint, stubborn ember of hope would one day outlast the iron empire that had sent them to war. In her final letter of that year, Lau wrote words that would become a testament. "If we ever return, we will tell our children that even in defeat, we were met with kindness. That is the memory I will cradle, not the roar of the war, but the quiet whisper of mercy." Christmas descended upon the Texas camp that year with a hushed and gentle grace. While war still raged across the Atlantic, a delicate dusting of snow drifted over the POW compound, a fleeting promise of peace. For the German women, it was a season of painful firsts. The first Christmas away from home, without family, without the familiar spires of churches against a winter sky, without the carols that once echoed through now silent, bombed-out streets. That morning, however, the camp stirred with an unusual energy. The American guards moved with a purposeful, almost festive air. Crates were unloaded, tables were dragged into the mess hall, and the air grew thick and warm with the impossible, heart-wrenching aromas of roasted meat and rich coffee. The women watched, their confusion a palpable thing. When the lunch bell chimed, they filed in as usual, only to stop dead at the threshold. The long utilitarian tables were draped in white cloths. Each plate held a feast, slices of roasted turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, gravy, and a perfect wedge of pie. Garlands of fresh pine snaked along the rafters, filling the air with a crisp, living scent. And from a battered gramophone in the corner, a melody spun out, so familiar it made hearts ache. Stille Nacht For a long moment, no one moved, suspended in disbelief. Then Elle whispered, her voice cracking. They remembered. Captain Harris stood at the front of the room, his hat held respectfully under his arm. "Ladies," he began, the translator giving weight to his quiet words. "Today's Christmas. The war's still on, but that don't change what this day means. So, no work today. Just food, music, and a little peace." A stunned silence held. Then slowly they took their seats. Some bowed their heads in silent prayer. Others simply stared at the bounty before them, afraid to touch it, as if it might vanish. It was the cowboy, Luke, who broke the spell. He raised his tin mug of coffee, his eyes finding the women he'd worked alongside. "Merry Christmas, ma'am," he said, his drawl soft and sincere. The translator repeated it, and a few women offered tentative, tear-filled smiles. One slowly raised her own cup in a silent toast. Then came the sound of a fork scraping a plate, and the spell was irrevocably broken. Laughter bubbled up, hesitant at first, then freer, lighter. For the first time since their capture, they ate until they were truly full. The room swelling with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stoves, a symphony of German murmurs blending with Texan drawls. Then, a final miracle. 2 soldiers carried in a small, proudly imperfect Christmas tree borrowed from the local town. It was adorned with simple tinsel, painted buttons, and stars carefully cut from ration cards. As it was placed by a window, catching the winter light, a guard produced a harmonica, another an old fiddle. Soon, the most unlikely of sounds echoed across the camp. Germans and Americans singing together. First, Silent Night in German, then Jingle Bells in a joyful, mangled chorus. By the end, the words no longer mattered. Only the shared melody did, Helga later wrote in her diary. "That night I saw the enemy share his bread with us. I saw men who had every reason to hate Jews instead to sing. And I think that was the first time I truly, in my soul, believed that the war could end." As the feast concluded, Captain Harris simply said, "You'll remember today long after any victory is forgotten." He was right. In the years to come, the German women would recall that Christmas not as prisoners of war, but as guests of a shared humanity, where kindness had bridged language, faith, and fences. And long after the last note of Silent Night faded into the Texas night, one enduring truth remained. Mercy had accomplished what bullets never could. By the spring of 1945, the Texas wind carried a new scent, the whisper of an ending. Newspapers that sometimes found their way into the camp were filled with stark, final words: collapse, Berlin, unconditional surrender. The German women read them in a heavy silence, their eyes scanning the headlines that spelled the death of the world they had known. When the radio crackled with the official announcement Germany had surrendered, the entire camp froze. It was May 8th, 1945. The guards slowly, respectfully removed their hats. Among the prisoners, tears fell, not born of pure joy or grief, but from a profound, hollowing confusion. Where did they belong now? Elle stood outside the barracks, staring into the vastness of the Texas sky. "It's over," she whispered, the words feeling alien on her tongue. Anna stood beside her, wrapping her arms around herself. "Then why does it still hurt?" Captain Harris called them all together. "Ladies," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "your country has surrendered. The war is done. You're safe now." His voice held a crack of emotion, not pity, but a shared, weary relief. For everyone, the long, brutal road had reached its end. That night the German women did not sing. They sat in small groups by the fence, watching the stars pepper the immense, dark sky. In the distance, the faint sounds of laughter and music carried from the ranch, the sound of a world moving forward. While for them, time had stopped. Some were weighed down by a strange shame, not for losing, but for the devastating realization of how completely they had been deceived. For years, they had been fed a portrait of America as a soulless, mechanical monster. But here, in this land of endless horizons and honest labor, They had witnessed something altogether different. A nation that fought with ferocity, but not with hatred. A people who believed that true order could and must be built upon a foundation of mercy. In the days that followed, the Americans loosened the reins, allowing the prisoners more freedom within the camp's confines. The fences remained, but the war inside every heart was over. They had arrived as enemies, steeped in terror, expecting extermination. They would leave as something else entirely. Women who had been broken open and remade, not by victory, but by an unexpected and unwavering dignity. There were no grand celebrations, no fluttering banners. Instead, the war's end was marked by a deepening of the small human gentleness that had already taken root. Guards freely shared cigarettes and chocolate bars. A Red Cross truck delivered not just necessities, but small luxuries: fragrant soap, fresh uniforms, and thick sheaves of writing paper. The women wrote home, many for the first time since their capture, their pens flying across the page. "Dearest mother," one letter began, "do not fear for me. The Americans treat us with more humanity than our own commanders ever did. They are not the monsters we were told to expect. They are men, and they have souls." For some, this devastating realization broke them more completely than the military defeat ever could. Helga, the teacher, was found one morning sketching the camp's fences. When a guard asked what she was drawing, she replied without looking up, "Freedom. I just haven't decided which side of the wire it's on anymore." Weeks later, the final orders arrived. Repatriation. As they boarded the trucks that would carry them to the coast, Captain Harris and a handful of the cowboys stood by to see them off. One woman, her hands trembling slightly, pressed a small embroidered handkerchief into the captain's hand. The red thread formed a delicate, hopeful flower. "For kindness," she said, in halting, practiced English. He accepted it with a solemn nod, tucking it into his jacket pocket. "For freedom," he replied. "You'll be all right." It was not a question, but a statement of faith. When the trucks rolled away, their dust hanging in the humid air, the camp felt profoundly empty. It was a void not just of people, but of the invisible, indelible bond forged through compassion in a place designed for confinement. That night, Captain Harris walked the silent grounds, the handkerchief a soft weight over his heart. He gazed at the empty bunks, the silent shower house, the horses grazing peacefully in the twilight, and murmured to the vast Texas sky, "Guess mercy really does win wars after all." The journey home began in the late summer of 1945. For the German women, the convoy of army trucks leaving the Texas camp felt like the closing of a chapter so beautiful and strange they knew they could never explain it. They were thinner, but their faces were no longer haunted. Their eyes, once hollow with fear, now held a quiet, steady light. The Americans provided each with a care package: soap, chocolate, a small American flag pin, and a handwritten note that read, "Good luck. You've earned your peace." Most tucked the gifts away as sacred talismans of a forgotten truce. At the harbor, as they boarded the ship bound for a broken Europe, the women turned for one last look at the receding shore. They had arrived as prisoners, but in the heart of Texas, they had been treated as human beings, fed, respected, and most miraculously trusted, Elle whispered to Anna, her voice thick with emotion. "It feels wrong to leave. It feels like we are leaving home behind." When they reached Germany, the contrast was a physical blow. Cities were skeletal, reduced to jagged teeth of rubble against a gray sky. The air was thick with the dust of ruin and the desperate grief of those searching for the missing. When the women tried to speak of the Americans' compassion, of the abundant food, the shared songs, they were met with stony silence or bitter accusations of betrayal. Helga confided in her journal, "We have returned to a country that is still at war with itself. They think we were brainwashed by luxury, but if believing in dignity is a crime, then I am guilty." In the years that followed, the former prisoners struggled to rebuild their lives from the ashes. Some became teachers or nurses in the shattered towns. Others married, raised children, and quietly tried to forget the war. But none ever forgot Texas. Elle kept the empty Coca-Cola bottle on her mantle, a relic not of victory or defeat, but of her own profound awakening. Anna, who had once frozen in terror before the shower, preserved a bar of American soap wrapped in paper. She told her daughter, "This was the day I learned not to fear the world," and Captain Harris, back on his ranch, kept the embroidered handkerchief in a small wooden drawer. When reporters later asked if he ever regretted his leniency, he shook his head. "We didn't beat them with hate," he said, his gaze steady. "We beat them by showing them what decency looks like." In 1957, a quiet reunion took place in Germany. The women who had once shared a barracks in Texas now shared photographs and fading memories of the horses, the barracks, the Christmas tree. Someone began to hum Stille Nacht, others joined in, and by the second verse, the room was united in tearful, grateful harmony. "We went to war believing strength was cruelty," one woman told a visiting historian. "Texas taught us that the greatest strength can be mercy." Their story would never be writ large in the history books, but among those who lived it, the memory endured, a quiet testament that even in the heart of war, humanity can not only survive but triumph. Because long after the guns fell silent and the borders were redrawn, what remained was not hatred or the empty glory of conquest. It was the memory of a Texas sunrise, the taste of shared bread, and the enduring proof that kindness too is a weapon, one that never, ever runs out of ammunition.